Nobody has ever opened it. That's a part that should stop you cold. Somewhere beneath the dry bed of a vanished river in southern Iraq, a machine that reads the invisible magnetism of the earth once traced the outline of a rectangular structure sitting in exactly the spot where a 4,000-year-old poem says the greatest king of the ancient world was sealed into the ground. Not a legend, not a myth dressed up for a thumbnail. A real survey, a real anomaly, a real text that describes a burial so strange and so specific that scholars still argue about what it means. And in the years since that shape appeared on a researcher's screen, nobody has put a shovel into the ground to find out what it actually is. Tonight we're going to look at the real story behind the tomb of Gilgamesh, the actual science, the actual poem, and the actual reason this mystery is still sitting there unsolved, along with the fake giant skeletons and secret military operations that people have invented to fill the silence. Stick with me, because separating what's true from what's fabricated here is a lot stranger and a lot more interesting than the fake version. To understand why anyone cares about a rectangle buried in an old riverbed, you have to start with who Gilgamesh actually was, or at least who the ancient world believed he was. He's the central figure of the oldest surviving work of literature that human beings have ever produced. Older than Homer, older than the Hebrew Bible, older than almost anything else still read today. His story survives on clay tablets written in cuneiform, a wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, tablets that were broken, scattered, buried, and painstakingly reassembled by archaeologists and translators over more than a century. The epic tells of a king who ruled the city of Uruk, and Uruk was not invented for the story. It was a real place. Its ruins still sit today near the site archaeologists call Walker, in the flat, sun-baked deserts of southern Iraq, not far from the modern city of Samawa. In the poem, Gilgamesh is no ordinary ruler. He is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a man of towering size and restless, almost unbearable strength, so powerful that his own subject begged the gods to create someone capable of matching him. That's worth pausing on, because it's the root of every giant myth that would later attach itself to his name. But it's important to be precise, because precision is exactly what separates a real mystery from an internet hoax. The superhuman size of Gilgamesh is a literary device. It's how the epic elevates its hero, the same way countless other ancient traditions describe their legendary kings and champions as impossibly large or impossibly strong. It's a poetic detail about a legendary figure, not a forensic description of a skeleton. Keep that distinction in your pocket, because it's going to matter a great deal later when we get to the fake photograph that claimed to show his actual bones. The epic follows Gilgamesh through friendship, loss, and an increasingly desperate search for a way to escape death altogether. He befriends a wild man named Enkidu, and the two of them go through legendary trials together. Then Enkidu dies, and something in Gilgamesh breaks. For the first time, he understands that he, too, will die, that even a being 2/3 divine has to eventually be lowered into the earth like everyone else. He wonders. He searches. He tracks down a survivor of a great flood who was granted eternal life, hoping to learn the secret for himself. And in the end, he fails completely. A plant that could have restored his youth is stolen from him by a serpent while he sleeps, and Gilgamesh returns home to Uruk having to accept the one truth he could not outrun. He will die like every other person who has ever lived. That's the emotional core of the oldest story we have as a species, a king who loses his war with mortality. But there's one detail near the end of the tradition that has pulled treasure hunters and researchers towards southern Iraq for well over 100 years, and it's a detail that makes the magnetometer survey we're about to discuss so genuinely eerie. Later material connected to the epic tradition describes what happens after Gilgamesh dies. According to that account, the people of Uruk do something remarkable to honor and protect their fallen king. They dam the Euphrates River. They divert the water out of its natural channel, draining a section of the riverbed until it lies exposed and dry. And there, down in the mud where the river had been flowing only days before, they build his tomb. Once it's finished, once the king is sealed inside, they release the dam and let the Euphrates flow back over everything. So the river itself becomes his guardian, and no ordinary grave robber could ever reach him. The water hides the tomb. The water protects the king. For thousands of years, that passage was read purely as poetry, a beautiful symbolic image of a hero returning to the elements, until a magnetometer, pushed slowly across a dry, abandoned channel of that same river, returned the outline of a built, rectangular structure sitting almost exactly where the account said it should be. Before we go any further, Though, we have to ask the question any honest version of this story has to ask first. Was Gilgamesh even a real person? Because if he's nothing more than a literary invention, then there's no body to bury, no tomb to build, and the structure in the riverbed is just a coincidence in the mud. The answer isn't simple, and this is where the story actually gets interesting rather than mystical. Among the surviving cuneiform document from ancient Mesopotamia is a text scholars call the Sumerian King List, a catalogue of the rulers of the early Mesopotamian cities, stretching back into a period so remote that legend and history blur together. On that list, among the kings of Uruk in the early dynastic period, roughly the 27th century BCE, is the name Gilgamesh. Not listed as a god, listed as a king, a ruler of a real city, recorded alongside other rulers whose historical existence has been independently supported by archaeological evidence. That changes the picture considerably. It suggests the hero of the world's oldest poem may have begun as a real person, a ruler who governed a real city, who fought wars, who eventually died and had to be buried somewhere like anyone else. So the picture that likely emerges is not a fairy tale invented out of nothing, but a legend that grew, layer by layer, around a real human core, which is how legends often work. A king lives, does something the culture remembers as remarkable, and over the generations that follow, the stories about him swell until the man is buried under centuries of embellishment, much the way his actual remains, if they exist, will be buried under sediment. Strip away the divine ancestry, the towering stature, the superhuman strength, all the additions poets lay on to a founding king to make him more than mortal, and what's left is plausible. A genuinely powerful ruler of Uruk, remembered so vividly that scribes were still copying his story onto clay tablets more than 1,000 years after he likely lived. If that man was real, his burial was probably real too, and if the tradition preserved even a fragment of what actually happened to his remains, even a distorted echo of it, then the strange detail of a river diverted, a tomb built in the mud, and the water release again might not be pure invention. That's a thought that has kept this mystery alive for so long, not the giant, not the monster slaying, but the oddly specific, oddly practical detail of an engineering project. Damming a river, draining a bed, building in the exposed mud, releasing the water again. That's not really the language of myth. Poets exaggerate strength, height, and divine parentage easily. But why would anyone bother inventing an entire river diversion procedure? It reads less like poetic flourish and more like a garbled memory of something that was actually carried out. Which is exactly why, for more than a century, this passage has drawn people to southern Iraq who read an ancient poem less as literature and more as a map. But here's a problem that stopped every one of them cold. You cannot dig up a legend. You can't take a shovel to a 4,000-year-old text and expect the ground to cooperate. The site of ancient Uruk, known today as Walker, is enormous, a vast field of eroded mounds baking under the southern Iraqi sun. At its height, Uruk may have been the largest settlement on the planet, home to tens of thousands of people, ringed by massive walls the epic itself boasts that Gilgamesh built with his own hands. Over the millennia, that great city collapsed inward on itself as its mud-brick architecture slowly dissolved back into the earth it was made from, until the whole metropolis became a series of low, undifferentiated ridges, nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding desert to anyone untrained in reading them. Meanwhile, the Euphrates did what rivers do. It wandered. Over centuries it shifted course, abandoning old channels and carving new ones, leaving ribbons of buried, silted-up riverbed threading through and around the dead city. Somewhere in all of that, in one lost channel, under an unknown depth of sediment, a tomb may have been built. Excavating blindly across a site that size, trench by trench, hunting for a single structure, could take 100 years and turn up nothing at all. For generations, the tomb of Gilgamesh remained exactly what skeptics said it was, a beautiful story with no way to test it. That changed with new technology. You can't dig up a legend, but as it turns out, you can map the ground it's buried in. In the years leading up to 2003, an archaeological survey team working at Uruk brought instruments that could do something no shovel ever could. They could read what lay beneath the surface without breaking that surface at all, tracing buried walls, vanished canals, and the ghost of an ancient street plan, all still there a few feet down, invisible to the eye but not to the instrument. The central tool in that work was a magnetometer, and to understand why what it found matters, you need to understand what the device actually does. A magnetometer measures the Earth's magnetic field, which isn't perfectly uniform. It flexes and shifts slightly depending on what's buried beneath it. The key fact for archaeology is that human construction disturbs that field. A mud brick wall, a fired hearth, a packed clay floor, the silted fill of an old ditch, each of these carries a slightly different magnetic signature than the undisturbed soil around it. Fired clay in particular leaves a mark that can last thousands of years because the heating and cooling process locks a faint, permanent magnetism into it. So a city that once fired its bricks, dug its canals, and packed its courtyards leaves behind a hidden pattern in the ground, a fingerprint of human activity pressed into the Earth's own magnetism. The instrument itself looks almost unremarkable, a lightweight frame carried at walking pace, a sensor held a fixed distance above the soil, a small computer logging thousands of readings every second. The survey team walked Uruk in tight, parallel lines, back and forth, meter by meter, day after day, recording data while the ancient ruins around them gave away nothing to the naked eye. When those readings were compiled and rendered as an image, the dead city came back into view. Not rubble, not vague suggestion, an actual plan. Streets appeared as straight lines. The great enclosing wall of Uruk, the one the epic itself boasts about, showed up as a long, sweeping band. Inside it, the survey traced building foundations, courtyards, and the dense layout of a place that once held tens of thousands of people. Canals threaded through all of it, their silted beds glowing faintly because the material filling them reacted differently to the sensor than the surrounding soil. For the first time, researchers were looking at the layout of one of the oldest true cities on Earth without moving a single grain of sand. That map alone would have justified the entire survey. But one particular feature drew far more attention than researchers ever intended, because the survey extended beyond the built-up core of the city, out across a broad, dark ribbon the instruments identified as a former course of the Euphrates, a channel the river had once flowed through and later abandoned. There, the magnetometer registered something that didn't look like a canal and didn't look like an ordinary building. It read as a distinct rectangular anomaly, sitting within the trace of the vanished river, with edges regular enough to suggest they'd been shaped by human hands rather than deposited naturally by moving water. On its own, a rectangular anomaly in southern Iraq isn't remarkable. The entire point of the survey was that Uruk is full of buried rectangles, because Uruk was a city, and cities are made of them. A magnetometer sees shapes, not names or stories. It can't tell you who built something, when, why, or whether anyone was ever laid to rest inside it. It can only tell you that the ground here is arranged differently than the ground over there, in a pattern that looks intentional. A cautious researcher looks at a rectangle in an old riverbed and thinks, interesting, worth noting, one anomaly among hundreds. But anyone familiar with the ancient text would feel something else entirely, because of everything that account claims about Gilgamesh's burial, the strangest and most specific detail, the one least likely to be invented casually, is that he wasn't buried in the city, and not on high ground, and not in an ordinary field. He was buried in the bed of the river itself, in a channel deliberately drained and then deliberately flooded again. And here, 4,000 years later, was a survey with no agenda and no interest in legends, flagging a rectangular, built-looking structure in exactly that kind of location, an abandoned channel of the river, a shape where shapes shouldn't naturally occur. The correspondence between the oldest story humanity has ever written down and the coldest, most neutral instrument science could bring to the site wasn't perfect, and it was never proof. The researchers involved were careful never to claim otherwise. But it was there, an honest, documented overlap between text and terrain. And once word of that overlap spread beyond academic circles, the careful qualifications, the part about shapes not being names, were often the first thing people left out, because a genuinely interesting fragment of information had entered the world, and from that small, honest kernel, something far less honest began to grow. The truth of what the magnetometer found was quiet and unfinished. What people built on top of it online was neither. And to understand how far the online version drifted from the facts, you have to sit with the one question the survey could never answer, no matter how many times a team walked that grid: whether anyone had ever actually gone down into that channel to look. Nobody had. That's the part the loudest. Most viral versions of this story tend to skip over. There was no excavation. No trench was ever cut into that old channel. No shaft was sunk toward the rectangle. The anomaly was mapped, documented in survey reports, and then, for reasons are entirely mundane rather than mysterious, left unexplored. The reason is simply the calendar. The magnetometer survey work at Uruk was carried out in the early 2000s, and by March of 2003, southern Iraq had become a war zone. Whatever plans anyone had to return with permits, excavation teams, and funding dissolved into checkpoints, instability, and years of conditions that made careful, permitted archaeological fieldwork extremely difficult across much of the country. You don't bring a delicate excavation into a landscape where roads are dangerous and antiquity sites are actively being looted. So the rectangle stayed exactly where it was, beneath the dry channel, undisturbed and unproven. And in that entirely explicable silence, a very different kind of story found room to grow. To a certain kind of storyteller, an unexcavated anomaly isn't an unfinished sentence. It's a locked door, and a locked door, the theory goes, is only ever locked because someone already got inside. So a second, invented act was grafted onto the real story. The claim spread that the war hadn't interrupted the science, that the war was somehow cover for it, that soldiers had been quietly redirected to the site, that a body had been lifted from the channel under cover of night and spirited away, and that the whole affair had been buried under official denial. To make that claim land, people needed a body, and a spectacular one. So images began circulating, enormous skeletons half exposed in date, a human skull the size of a boulder, small excavators dwarfed next to a rib cage the size of a boat's frame, all labeled as proof of a giant Gilgamesh finally recovered. These images are fabrications, not disputed, not the subject of ongoing debate among researchers, simply and cleanly fake. The most widely shared of these giant skeleton photos traces back to a digital art competition, a contest where participants were invited to composite convincing hoax images for fun. The winning entries were clever, well-lit, and technically impressive, and they escaped the contest and spread across the internet with new captions attached, claiming they showed excavations at Uruk. None of them were photographed there. None of them show a real dig site connected to this survey at all. The bones in those images never existed as bones. They existed as digital composites layered over ordinary photographs of unrelated excavations in entirely different countries. And the supposed military recovery operation, the midnight extraction, the classified crate, none of it is supported by a single verifiable document, a single named archaeologist, or a single credible source. It's a story that requires a tomb to have been opened in order to wake, and the tomb has never been opened. That's really the entire rebuttal. Strip the hoaxes away, and what remains is smaller, stranger, and more genuinely interesting than any giant skeleton. On one side sits a real and unnerving correspondence, an ancient account describing an extremely specific and unusual burial method, a river diverted, a tomb built in the exposed bed, the water release again, matched by a real rectangular anomaly sitting in a real abandoned channel of that same river. On the other side sits the plain, unglamorous truth of the instrument itself. A magnetometer reads shapes, not names, not dates, not intentions. A rectangle in a floodplain could be a tomb. It could just as easily be a warehouse, a temple platform, a granary, a kill, or a house the river swallowed and buried thousands of years ago during an ordinary flood season nobody bothered to record. Southern Mesopotamia is thick with buried rectangles, and the great majority of them are nobody special. The odds that any one particular anomaly happens to be the resting place of the most famous figure in the world's oldest surviving story are, by simple statistics, quite long. And the only way to shorten those odds is to actually dig, and no one ever has. Which leaves us exactly where the survey left us, and exactly where an honest account of this mystery has to end, with the door still shut. The map is real. The instrument readings are real. The anomaly in the old channel is real, and it's still sitting there tonight, under the same silt, holding the same shape it held when the sensor first passed over it decades ago. Beside it sits a text, thousands of years old, describing a burial nobody thought could be literally true, matched by a machine that had never heard the poem and simply walked the ground and found something in the exact kind of place the text described. Then the region became a war zone, and everyone had to leave, and no one has ever gone back to look. This mystery survives not because it was covered up, but because it was interrupted mid-sentence and never finished. Maybe that structure is nothing more than a storeroom that flooded during an ordinary season no scribe thought worth recording, and if someone opened it tomorrow, they'd find broken pottery and river silt, and a small lesson in how easily we read our own hopes into the ground. Or maybe it's something much closer to what an ancient poem described, still waiting for the day archaeologists are finally able to return and open it properly. The genuinely remarkable part is that the question is still open, not closed by a cover-up, not settled by a hoax, just honestly and patiently unanswered, sitting in a flat, sun-baked land where the first cities on Earth once stood. So I'll leave the choice with you, because at this point it really is a choice and not a settled fact. Do you think that structure in the old channel of the Euphrates could genuinely be connected to the burial the epic describes? Or is it simply a rectangle in the mud that our own imaginations have dressed up into something more? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want to be here the next time a story like this one gets properly examined, go ahead and subscribe.